First, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I would like to introduce Deborah Sparrow, a member of the Musqueam Nation, who is a renowned weaver. Her work, which is sponsored by the Vancouver Art Gallery, is on display at the SkyTrain station at Granville in Georgia. It is part of her ongoing goal to blanket the city with sailage.
I want to see. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for asking us to come forward. When I say us, I mean my community of Musqueam, my relatives Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh, our shared territories here where we've made an agreement to get along instead of not and worry about those boundaries. So on behalf of my chief, Wayne Sparrow, who, yes, shares the same last name as me, because he's my younger brother, and I told him everything about his wife's chief. On any certain day, he'll tell you not, because we have great discussions about, our community and our home. And Wayne was a very young little boy when our father passed, so he didn't have the opportunity to know him, so we share our information with him that our father was a great chief and a fisherman, a band manager, a father. And so Wayne and our grandfather as well all come from that line of leaders who passionately care about our people. So while they're busy doing the politics side, I've been busy deepening my roots into who I am, away from assimilation. And so when I was younger, I sort of never really felt like I wanted to continue my studies in school. So I have no degrees, which I'm kind of proud of. I have no, no criteria that says that I am anything other than a knowledge keeper for my grandfather, who passed that to me. And I honor that as much as any degree anyone has, the values of what he left behind for us. But he didn't really leave them behind because we know that he still whispers in my ear and nudges me every once in a while to bring forward the information that is important to voice on behalf of our ancestors who aren't here but were so wrongly done in our past. So they are also part of our presence. And one thing he taught me for sure was to never forget our past, never forget who we are. He said, when I'm gone, I want you to know who you are and know where you come from, because if you don't know that, that's when they get you. And I know what he means by that, because I've been in many incidences where I've had to defend the integrity of our people. And I'll continue to do it through the work I do. So when we talk about the transit over here on Granville, it's a way in which we transferred our very traditional designs into a more contemporary way as we move forward, back and forth in balance. And I think that's the value of what I've come to understand is when I was deeply rooted enough in the earth and in my people, then only could I share the balance between what was and what is. And I love that now. I love to bring forward into the city the beauty and integrity of these magnificent people who lived in this land for thousands of years. And in living here, they paid attention to everything in their environment, of course, because it was a reflection of them through the creative process. So I'm fortunately enough to be gifted that, to have that responsibility as well, to be the voice for those individuals, to me, as I said, were all so wrongly done. And I honor them now. I honor them, and I hope as they view this world that we live in today, they know the seriousness of accepting that. responsibility. And wrapping the city of Vancouver is just one way metaphor that I've always thought about. I honestly didn't believe it would become a reality, but thankful to the Mural Festival of the City of Vancouver, as well as now the art gallery stepping up and different little pockets of Vancouver acknowledging, and I hold my hands up to our City of Vancouver because they are very open to meeting with us and meeting us halfway now. That this is not only our history, it's your history as well. We have been here for thousands of years, 9,400 years of Jericho, 300 years in my 3,000 years in my backyard, 3,500 years on the Fraser River where there was a basket found and brought out of the mud where it was preserved. And it's a beautiful, beautiful crab trap. 3,000 years old. And I was like, wow, these people, they knew what they were doing. And yet we today as modern day people, we don't think about that. We don't stop to think about what life was like here pre-contact and how really amazing it was. And so I'm very, as again, honored to be a part of that beautiful life that they had and bring it into a more modern day, but also, as I was mentioning, the balance between keeping our traditions alive, but also realizing as we are in the middle of Vancouver Aboriginal Fashion Week, for those of you who don't know, I suggest you go on Saturday to the Vancouver Museum where they'll be rounding up the last day. I had the opportunity to come forward on the first day, which was Monday, and show works that I have played with over the last years, moving forward and taking my textiles from handmade to commercial into fashion, taking them out and wrapping them around the city and using the fibers in the connection in any way that we can. So I think it would be an exciting thing to go to their grand finale night on Saturday. If you haven't got tickets, I think there's still some available. But as we end the evening tonight, I just want to end with a little poem, not a prayer, by our late Chief Dun George from the Slave Nation. May the flowers fill your hearts with beauty. May hope forever wipe away your tears. But above all, may silence make us strong. And maybe you would wonder how silence can make us strong. If we're paying attention to our histories, we're listening. And we're listening to all the things in which we usually don't. And so when I'm at home and I'm out by the river and I can hear the water hitting the shoreline, then I'm in silence. And when I wake up in the morning, if I open my window, I have a small opportunity to hear the birds singing in the morning and the eagles as they feed. And we have an opportunity to hear them singing in the background. And then the planes take over. And then the boats start to make noise. And so it all balances itself out, I suppose, in the long run. But just want to hold my hands up to each and every one of you. Hope you enjoy the evening and our guest that's here on our land. And as I leave you talking about the unceded territories of our land, I've sort of stopped saying that now because I feel like when the city announced it 2 or 3 years ago, I don't know what that means anymore. If it's just a statement that, Mayor Gregor said to feel important about leaving his position. We're on the unceded territories, but what does that really mean? So I'm going to work on that with my brother and see if we can have some definition put to it and move on it and not just say it. So Hachka, enjoy your evening until we meet again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenna. I'm Denise Alexichuk, and I teach art history at the School for Contemporary Arts. I'd like to thank some of the people and institutions that have helped to bring about the President's Dream Colloquium on Creative Ecologies. President Andrew Petter for his vision of having SFU professors teach a graduate course with the help of the world's leading thinkers. My collaborators, Zoe Druick and Michelle Levy, Melanie O'Brien, director, and Cheyenne Turians, curator of Simon Fraser University Galleries, Anne Johal, director of the Office of Community Engagement, Sasha Colby, director of Graduate Liberal Studies, and Samantha Diamond, Brady Granville, Michelle Kim, and at the School for the Contemporary Arts. I wanted to mention also that there's a reception after the talk in the lobby outside of the O'Dane Gallery. It's my pleasure to introduce Candice Hopkins, a celebrated curator of contemporary art and a citizen of the Carved Cross Tagish First Nation. Candice has brought the work of Indigenous artists from around the world to the forefront of contemporary art world. Her critical curatorial projects make curating an art in itself. For her, curating is a process that involves collaboration, risk-taking, the meticulous, compassionate practice of reclaiming Indigenous knowledge. In her own words, it embraces the unquantifiable, fugitive, and unknowable, and like the shoreline, resists the systems that seek to discipline and control. Early in her career, Candice worked for several years as curator at the director at the Western Front. Then she completed her MA in curatorial studies at Bard College in upstate New York, where she studied with the veteran curator of the New Museum, Marcia Tucker. In the past few years, she has curated a number of major exhibitions, most recently the inaugural Toronto Biennial of Art, which opened this September. The exhibition includes more than 100 artworks by international artists, many of which are commissioned works. She was one of the curators of Sightlines, the Biennial in Santa Fe, called Unsettled Landscapes, which took place in 2014. And she was the co-curator of the Canadian Pavilion at the 58th Venice Biennale in 2019, which featured the groundbreaking media work of Azuma Productions, based in Iqaluit and Montreal. In 2017, she was part of the curatorial team for Documented 14 in Athens, Greece, and Kassel, Germany, working closely with the magnificent and beloved late artist Gatok. Finally, her touring exhibition, Soundings, an exhibition in 5 parts, co-curated with Dylan Robinson, first appeared at the Agnes Everington Art Gallery at Queen's University and will travel to the Helen Belkin Gallery at UBC next fall, gaining new artists and players at each location. The exhibition focuses on the topic of listening and how that might change how we relate to the earth. Candice has published numerous essays and given talks from Rotterdam to Dakar and has won impressive prizes for her work. The title of her talk is Towards the Practice of Decolonial Listening, Sounding the Margins. Please join me in welcoming Candice Hopkins.
Thank you, Denise, for all your work in bringing me here and all of your kind generosity. It's really an honor to be back in Vancouver. I also want to raise my hands. I know that Deborah had to leave, but to hear her words was really amazing, and also this poem that was about silence and how silence can give us strength. And there's some nice resonances between those words and some of what I'll speak about tonight. So what I'm speaking about tonight is a kind of ongoing series of musings, let's say, about listening, trying to think about how I can also move towards what might be a decolonial practice of listening. It's a series of interrelated thoughts, practices, some of which you might know intimately, others might be new to you. And I want to begin by the words of a composer, R. Murray Schafer, from an essay that he wrote in 1974 called Open Ears. He said, We have no earlids. We are condemned to listen. And while we can't close our ears, it doesn't mean that we listen to everything that is said. And this is particularly true for those whose ears seem more closed than they are open. How can we attune ourselves to pick up different frequencies, to feel what reverberates, and to hear what sounds at the margins? What might be a decolonial practice of listening? Dylan Robinson suggests that this is necessarily an intersectional action, one that takes place both within our bodies and ideologically. How can we, this is his question, tune out colonial sub-frequencies that constantly hum in our ears? How can we hear beyond them, beneath them, and aside from them? Perhaps a missing component of discourses on decolonization is the practice of deep listening, a term that's often associated with the late composer Pauline Oliveros. Sometimes it seems like in the visual arts, we're so conditioned by our eyes that we've all but forgotten about our ears. But many of our minor voices sing out into these voids, and voids are never truly voids. Darlene Manning, a friend who lives in Toronto, says that if we listen, harmonics are everywhere if we can just tune in. She says that this includes the harmonics of the stones, who are our grandmothers and grandfathers, and for Dene people, including Raven Chacon, whose work is on the image behind me, they are indeed the gods. This includes harmonics of the leaning trees that always reveal the direction of the wind. And they're teaching in the way that they bend to pressure rather than break. This includes also the harmonics of the water. And it's water that in this place that you can sense by feeling it, by smelling it, and by hearing it sometimes before you see it, including here on the shores of this ocean. So lately I've been opening my ears. This is some of what I think is sounding at the margins, and for me it's a chorus that's becoming louder by the day. A collective of minor voices filled with major players might consider it to be something of a peripheral ensemble, but we practice every day. We condition our vocal cords, and we're finding our tune. To some it might sound like a cacophony, but noise is generative. For Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, they call the cacophony extra musical. We hear something in them, in the cacophony, that reminds us that our desire for harmony is in fact arbitrary. So in other words, listening to cacophony, to noise, tells us that there's a world beyond to the structures that we inhabit and that also inhabit us. So then what might be the sound of the sovereign? Is it here now? Is it among us? I think we heard it a little bit earlier. Is it here as you're listening to me and I'm listening to you? For Raven, who scores behind me, he has a definition of music and he calls it beauty lining up with other beauty. That doesn't necessarily mean it's harmonics. It can be the universe reminding you that it's listening to you. It might be repeating sounds, overlapping sounds, cacophony of sounds, to break the spell or the convention of time that we've been forced to adhere to. Music is the basis for every ceremony, just as art is the basis for every ritual. So what might be decolonial listening? Decolonization, as we know it, is an active practice. It's a verb, it's not a metaphor. It's a present process that echoes into the future. And I think that the way to begin with this, the way to bring people to this place, is to first listen to those who are here. So freeing some of the voices wedged beneath dominant history has the possibility, I think, to redress some of the violence that's reduced Indigenous people, Indigenous lives to numbers and ciphers and fragments of discourse. And perhaps by dwelling in these fragments, by spending time in the discomfort of the incomplete, of listening to the shards that often now stand in for history, it's possible to attune our ears to hear something of these stifled voices. The politics of colonial entanglement offer the possibility not only to hear what is sounding, but also to listen to the silences as well. I wanted to read a short part of a poem by an elder, a Tlingit elder, who passed away a couple of years ago. Her name is Nora Marks Duenheier, and it's called Trapped Voices. She became an anthropologist so she could speak back, and she wrote many important books, especially about encounters, and the first encounters that were relayed of Russians coming to what were our lands. Trapped voices, she says, frozen under a sea ice of English, buckle, surging to be heard. We say, listen for sounds. They are as important as voices. Listen, listen, listen. One of the first stories I wanted to relay is a little farther afield. It relates to an activist that I've had the chance to meet and a storyteller, Niila Sambi. He lives in Sápmi, on the corner, just on the border of northern Norway and northern Finland. But he has a connection to here. So in 1982, Niilas sought refuge with different native communities here, including the Nuhal, Chilcotin, Haisla, and the Kanai, or Blood Nation. His self-exile became infamous in his home and in his newfound territory in Native America. Niilas had escaped prison in Norway and temporarily assumed a new identity after being charged with the attempted bombing of a bridge in 1979 during mass protests against the building of what was an even more massive hydroelectric dam near Alta, which is in Sápmi, in traditional Sami territory. So the Norwegian government had decided to build the dam without notifying anyone in Alta, in Masi. Masi is a traditional Sami community that goes back thousands of years. And Niilas said that the way that he actually escaped from prison is quite a long story. We were in conversation when we met up in Norway, and he said that the way that he escaped prison was to dress up as a white man, and he said that he looked like a Sami version of Elton John, including platform shoes. So he dyed his hair blonde, and he escaped actually out of the hospital after he'd become quite sick, and then he came to Canada. So he was charged with being a terrorist because of the attempted bombing of the bridge, of which he lost his arm and one of his eyes. And this was a charge that would have had him spend much of his life behind bars. But the protests actually sparked a collective consciousness raising within Norwegian society who hadn't been paying attention at all to what was going on in Sápmi. And the government temporarily halted construction during this protest, which was in front of Norwegian Parliament in Oslo. They temporarily halted construction while they heard all of the concerns, and then later decided to proceed anyway. But this moment had other consequences as well. In Norway, it marked the first time that Sami perspectives were given serious coverage in mainstream media. It started something of a Sami Rights Commission, and this was initiated in 1980. And then to follow was Sami Parliament, a parallel governance structure that was formed out of this collective dissent. But his exile in Canada was also a moment of consciousness raising. Niilas was adopted into 7 First Nations communities, and this was initiated by the late Grand Chief, the Secwepemc Chief, George Manuel. And he was one of the initiators of the World's Council of Indigenous Peoples. Hosting Nilas was a way for these communities to reinforce and test the bounds of their sovereignty, so their right to determine who is a citizen of their community and who is not the federal government, and to communicate with the government then on a nation-to-nation basis. When Nilas was eventually detained along with his wife and daughter by RCMP in Alberta when he was living on the Blood Reserve, one of the chiefs responded with a strongly worded declaration. He said, "It is the position of the Nuxalk Nation's traditional chief that Nilas Sambi was arrested and is being detained illegally. The Nuxalk Nation maintains its right to self-determination, to its own laws on matters concerning citizenship. Outstanding issues are now under negotiation, and this includes self-government and jurisdiction over membership. The application of Canadian colonial laws in this case determines the lack of good faith on behalf of the Government of Canada in its negotiations with Indian nations." Nilas has been back in Sapmi since 1984, and during his absence the charges were reduced, but this didn't stop him from holding the government and his own people accountable. And as a result, he's physically lost his voice. He can only speak in a whisper now. And he's one of the many voices that continues to speak back, even at the risk of not being heard. His revolutions are often imperfect, and he relayed that even in Sami Parliament, which emerged out of an exceptional moment of Sami resistance and agency, complicity still seeps in part because it modeled itself after the colonial government as a kind of mirror and a foil. So in the fissures that this creates, deals have been made with resource extraction companies, and agreements are struck that also undermine Sami rights to traditional territories and practices. So recently, I came across Nilas's YouTube channel. This is one of his most recent videos, Soagis Alani, and it's centered on a series of teachings where his colleagues share knowledge regarding fishing, harvesting of wood, the carving of wood, making dioji, instrument making, weather patterns, seasonal changes, spirituality. The video itself is interspersed with yoiking, and this was a practice that was banned during the Norwegianization. They always say Norwegianization, they don't say colonization until more recently, of Sami people. And for me, there's a kind of particular teaching that's mobilized in these videos, one that's both equal parts theory and practice, actually perhaps more practice than theory. And it was a way, I think, to resist assimilation practices and to pass this knowledge on to future generations. So I wanted to play one part, and it's a yoik. And during this yoik, we see the harvesting of birch. But what I understand of yoiks is that yoiks are never really made about the subject, but you actually have to yoik it. So in yoiking it, in a way, you become it. You become its rhythms, you become its transformations, and this is what you communicate to others. So let's listen to a short clip.
나라 사타 망가 네나 테베 라와 잘메 라라.
So even though it doesn't seem like a lot of these videos have a huge following, I feel that what he's doing is almost like creating an archive for the future, when people will start paying attention again. Now to something that I think people are a bit more familiar with, but I also thought that it was important to listen again to Bodick. So this copper breaking, which started as a walk, a 10-day walk, from Alert Bay to Victoria to speak back to how farmed salmon was making the wild stock sick. It became a movement, including hundreds of people, that then, took place on the steps of Parliament Hill. So there, Bo and his collaborators sang certain songs, including songs that talk about the moment when boys become men. And the cutting of the copper on the steps of the Parliament was a means to shame the government for its injustices, for its inability to hear what people had been saying for hundreds of years. And he said that a copper breaking, until it took place in Victoria, had not taken place in these lands for, as far as he could recount, 124 years. When they broke the copper on the steps of Parliament, it was something like an uninvited gift. They left the pieces there. They wrapped it in the words of the so-called apology that Harper had given in response to the injustices of the residential schools. And it was an uninvited gift because what the government decided to do with the evidence of the actions of the broken pieces of copper was actually to give it back to museums in British Columbia. So they didn't accept it, to a place where they felt that it was more comfortable and would be held, I guess, differently. What I was interested in is how this might have created a kind of rupture. It took place after all the soundings that had taken place during I Don't Know More. So I was thinking about how these sounds established presence, whether they changed anything, whether they might have changed the course of the future. So something that often wasn't spoken about this movement was, and I think that it's important to bring this out here, was that when they started raising their voices, he was actually, really encouraged by his daughters, Linnea and Geraldine, to do something. They were inspired by all of the uprisings that were taking place over I Don't Know More, and they thought that it was a way to try to give voice to what was happening to the salmon that were being sickened, the other salmon that were being forced to grow at unnatural rates and spending their entire lives in small enclosures, never allowed to spawn. So they called attention to this through walking, and with this walking, through song, which to me started to perform something of the acoustics of the Decolonial. So I wanted to listen. So this is them singing at Parliament Hill. So of course what led to this was something that I also wanted to harken back to and listen to once again, and this is the sounds of I Don't Know More that grew out of a time of great disconnect and discontent and the need to be heard. And I think during this moment we came together in what might have been considered a little bit of a homelessness. But I also thought that it was a moment where we started to learn again from improvisation, because improvisation was at the heart of this moment, and it had a common form, and that was the round dance, something that almost everyone knew and could take part in. And it felt like all songs could be welcome and all rhythms perhaps accepted. So an important part, I think, of decolonization is the refusal to be the broken part. And I wanted to cite someone who also spoke during these lectures, Leanne Simpson. She wrote in a poem entitled Leaks, she says, "For every one of your questions, there is a story hidden in the skin of the forest. Use them as flint, fodder, love songs, medicine. You are from a place of unflinching power, the holder of our stories, the one who speaks up the chance for spoken up words drowned in ambush. You are not a vessel for white settler shame, even if I am the housing that failed you." What I particularly liked about this moment, and the ones that we witnessed as well down in Albuquerque, New Mexico, is they often took place in places of public commerce, in shopping malls. And here you see in Saskatoon, just at the foyer of Shoppers Drug Mart. And at the center are the drummers and the singers. So there's a theorist, Laura Ann Stoller, and she has a term that I think is a bit useful, especially in this moment. She calls it this term colonial aphasia. She says that the innocence of which James Baldwin spoke of in 1962, and that is that the violence towards Black lives on the colonial frontier cannot be allowed to adopt a guise of innocence. Innocence to the violence that happened, innocence to the accountability now. She says that the sense of innocence of which Baldwin speaks is one of the elements of colonial aphasia, but her definition goes further. Colonial aphasia implies, in some cases, a disassociation so profound that colonial history becomes unspeakable. And that's certainly the case, I think, in the United States. It's less the case here now. And this aphasia produces a breakdown in communication, and it has thus the inability to match language, be it written, spoken, read, or even gesturally, to thought. And this is despite the fact that the senses and other faculties are completely intact. So then it implies such a profound breakdown that the horrors of the past not only go unspoken, but can remain incomprehensible, perhaps even unlistenable, even when their effects are acutely felt in the present. So for me, then, the sounds of Idle No More became a rupture in this, a kind of call to order, and a call to order that continues to resonate now. So when ethnomusicologists first started working in Canada, one of them, Ida Halperin, when she was immigrating to Canada from Europe, she was questioned by citizenship, by the government, in terms of her interest in studying Indigenous sound and song. And in fact, they were really dismissive of her. They said initially, well, you know, they don't have music. And she disagreed. And this meant that, you know, the sounds that they were hearing, so our songs, and many of which were banned at the time, especially potlatch songs, were not considered music because they had no harmony, and they were still considered something savage. So for me, I think that that's something to embrace. So these words, and perhaps her practice, is a reminder to reclaim something of the wildness that so threatened the newcomers, to uncivilize in order to unleash the potential in other systems, in indigenous social contracts, in native understandings of reciprocity, healing, and harmony, and noise. Thus, this impetus isn't only about reclaiming language, reclaiming sound, reclaiming culture, but it's also about augmenting all of the things that were thought to be so threatening in us, a reclamation that is admittedly rife with colonial entanglements. And while it might not be possible to unsnarl every knot that now binds us, I think it is possible to separate off a few threads in order to begin making new narratives from these experiences. So this megaphone was first activated in an act of protest in 1991, and it's sounding again. Rebecca Belmore's work is concerned with voice, particularly those voices that maybe aren't amplified. And it also amplifies those that perhaps need a broader audience, those that are displaced and those who have to continually make their home wherever they can. So on March 10th, 1990, this was the beginning of the so-called Oka crisis, or what people call the Mohawk Resistance. And this was a crisis that ruptured the thin veneer of moderate Canadian society and exposed something of a festering wound beneath. And the standoff was sparked by a decision by the mayor of the French-Canadian village of Oka to expand the golf course from 9 to 18 holes over traditional territory of the nearby community of Ganasatake, whose land rights had been continually degraded and had shrunk since the 1700s. So it was the women who formed a line to protect the stand of trees that grew over their ancestral territories. And then this line escalated into a bitter 78-day protest. During the defense of what little remained of their territories, the voices of Indigenous peoples were drowned out or blatantly manipulated by mainstream media at that moment. So she saw this as an opportunity to speak back, and she started almost immediately, in time for Canada's embarking on a number of activities to celebrate 500 years since the arrival of Columbus, she oversaw the building of a massive megaphone out of finely inlaid wood veneer with decorative finishes of moose hide and skillfully cut leather lashing. The megaphone then moved around the country to different communities, visiting those who wanted it and those who needed it. And its large size was something of an echo of the tone deafness towards issues facing Indigenous communities, and it became something of a transitory monument. And I think it's easy sometimes to overlook the ecological dimensions of this sculpture, but it was made in response to a land rights dispute. Women calling attention not only to the rights of their ancestors to remain undisturbed, but also to the rights of the trees and their roots and the land that they grew upon. Sorry, there's a bit of glitch. The image keeps going on and off. And so what changes when we start to think of those trees as ancestors as well and as witnesses? So we know that trees listen to one another, that if one spruce, for example, is being attacked by an invasive beetle, it warns the others, and then those quickly overproduce an overabundance of sap to try to save themselves. But what I thought was kind of amazing about how people use this megaphone is that more often than not, it wasn't necessarily a kind of speaking back to a colonial deafness that took place over the megaphone, but it was mostly people singing, it was people playing violin, and it was people speaking their mother tongues. So when you turn the megaphone around, you can imagine that it's a listening device as well. Listening implies a relationship or relation of exchange. What changes also if we begin to think of the land as a listener, attuned to our reverberations and to the multitude of frequencies. So when we invited Rebecca to take part in Documenta 14, I asked her first if she might consider making another sound work, but she chose silence instead. She spent a number of days walking the city with her sister Florine, and during those days she was actually looking for the quietest place, in part because at that moment in time, Athens was a city of almost daily protest, and it was a city where increasingly those who were searching for other lives, who had been displaced from their homelands, were on the shores of the city. This is the port of Piraeus, and this is a photograph that Rebecca took. And their transitory homes were increasingly becoming permanent ones. Rebecca found that the quietest place in the city of Athens was on top of Philippopoul Hill, which is also known as the Hill of the Seven Muses. And it's an ancient site that predates the buildings of the Acropolis. So she decided to once again work with local materials. She collaborated with a local sculpture studio and a local sculptor named Vangelis Ilias, and all of the sculptors that worked with him were all women, which was not normal in that part of Athens, where all the marble studios were. And this piece of marble, this tent is carved from a single piece of marble, was taken from the other side of the mountain where the marbles came for the Acropolis. So Rebecca, this became something of a monument to the transitory. And for her, what was important was, of course, the thing itself, but more than that, the view from whence you were inside. Because what you look at when you're inside is the Parthenon. It's perfectly framed by the entrance of the tent. And in a way, it was a space between these two architectural monuments, one modest and temporary, formed out of an emergency, a permanent emergency, and the other, one of the symbols of the emergence of Western democracy, that it became a space to consider those for whom conventional forms of democracy fail, and for those who do not have the rights of citizens. So I was thinking more about what might be the acoustic dimensions of the migrant and the refugee, the state of being that for the scholar Paul Carter entails the concept of origin that ceases to have value and that's replaced by the notion of beginnings repeatedly begun due to the collapse of an entire auditory topography. This is another work that was created for Documenta 14 by an artist named Maratana Serra, who started her career as a journalist. She only recently got involved in doing art as a form of speaking back. This is an installation called Pile of Sapmi, and it's made out of reindeer skulls that her brother had to shoot as part of the reindeer cull in Sapmi, in their region. And all of reindeer herding within Sapmi, in Norway at least, is governed by what's called the Reindeer Act. And the Reindeer Act was instituted by the government in 2007. This is the length of it, and we wanted to show the act in its entirety. And it was one of the few acts that was generated by Norwegian government that hadn't been yet translated into either Sapmi or Sami language or English, and so we used some of the funds for the translation. And this was her first action, and her first action took place out of the courthouse where her brother was first fighting for his rights as a young herder, and his rights for not only a way of life and culture, but for him also a form of income. But she saw resonances between this and the way that colonialism had been enacted in the plains, both in Canada and the United States. This is an image from the United States. This is a pile of buffalo bones. And when they were killing buffalo by the thousands, much of their bones were ground down and made into fertilizer. And so for her, it was like a continuation of this. And their case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the end, on appeal, they ended up losing. And part of the reason that we think that they lost is because the reason that they want to control the reindeer so much at this point in time is because any lands that reindeer are on cannot be host to other forms of oil and gas exploration and mining. So by controlling the reindeer herds, it means then if you shrink their territory, it opens up other territory for exploration. And now with the permafrost very quickly thawing in the north, it's opening up all of these new reserves. So this is one of the last songs that sounds that I want to share with you. And I want to it is.
Silent and prayerful, guys. Power and fire. Yep. Gotta be quiet.
This is a clip that was recorded by Raven, who'd spent almost 2 weeks at Standing Rock during the No DPL protest. And during that time, he recorded much of what he heard. He also recorded a silent protest on a bridge that I'll describe in a moment. But first, this image. So this is an image of sound weaponized, where the private security firm is using long-range acoustic devices, which are a sound weapon that can be directed, they're directional, so they can be directed at you, aimed at you to such a frequency that they can make your ears bleed, but they're considered a non-lethal weapon. They were first used on ships, and now they're used often during protests. First during the G20. So there was a story that he told me there, and I want to read some of it here. So I was interested in these moments when words fail, when silence takes over. So during the No DPL protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, water protectors staged a powerful action. So with elders leading, more than 1,000 women walked to the center of the bridge over what is now called the Missouri River to occupy the only middle ground between them and the police and private security firms that were called in to protect the interests of corporations involved. But when they reached the center of the bridge, the women stood together in absolute silence. But we know through contemporary music, and we know just through living and being, that silence is never truly silence. And soon, other sounds were heard, other sounds were amplified for those who had gathered. And these were the sounds of terror and surveillance. Everyone present could hear the constant hum of drones overhead, both the drones of the water protectors and the drones from the other side that were recording everyone's every move. The buzz of the private security firms' handheld radios, the metallic clicks of police as they readied their firearms and prepared canisters of tear gas. But the authorities were prepared for the usual forms of protest, but not for this one. In the absence of sounds and words, the women became another kind of critic, their silence a powerful affront to corporate abuse of power, and our inability to think beyond the ever-insatiable need for more resources. So their decision not to raise their voices turned them into something of a destabilizing force. Here they are. So in their silence, they achieved an interruption. As a speech act, an interruption can jar the speaker, the person who has voice. Interruptions sometimes happen where there is a sense that the speaker simply isn't listening if they're not paying attention. They also happen when the other person can no longer stay silent and is overwhelmed by the urge to say something, anything, even when it carries no words. So is this then also a decolonial harmonics? So let's have a listen. I'm nearly finished, but I wanted to use this work as a bit of a transition to the end. This is an image of a video still, of a feature-length video by Isuma. They don't call themselves a collective, actually, they call themselves a team. They're a team of filmmakers based in Igloolik and also in Montreal. And this is called One Day in the Life of Noa Piagatuk. Noa Piagatuk was an elder who was one of the last people to move to the settlement of Igloolik. And after he moved, Zach Kunuk started taking a series of videos of him, of interviews, of which now on Isuma's website there are almost 30 clips. And I listened to a lot of them today because at the very end of this, which is a reenactment of one day in his life, you hear Noah singing. And to me, what was most profound about that moment of him singing was he was singing about the water and his life on the water. He wasn't singing about the settlement of Igloolik, where he had finally been forced to move to. He was singing about the land. So this recounts an encounter where a man on behalf of the Canadian government, a man who had moved to Canada for a job from Europe that they call Boss, comes and encounters Noah's family, extended family, on the sea ice as they're out hunting seal. And he's trying to convince them to move to Igloolik. And Noah's met his kind before, and he says this, he says, for 3 months, it was my job to take my dog team, a priest around, and he recounts this to Boss, and he says, after all that work, I took him everywhere. I was expecting some form of payment, of reciprocity, not necessarily money. And he said all he gave me was a Bible. So he was a bit, he kind of knew what the game was with Boss. And the interesting thing about Boss, too, is that you can tell that he's dressed very differently. He's dressed in caribou, and he's also dressed in a way that is much too warm for this time. So whenever you're dressed too warm in the north, you're at risk of freezing to death because your sweat gets trapped inside your clothes. But the most important central character of the video, aside from Noa Piagatuk, is the translator. And while it might not appear so at first, the translator is one of the central characters. And he's the one who's communicating both what is spoken and unspoken. And he goes in between. He's privy to what each man speaks. But the audience is also privy to another level of discourse, and that's what he decides to translate or not, or what in some cases I think he deliberately mistranslates or decides not to relay to the other. And the translator becomes a stand-in for some concepts that were largely untranslatable, things like the promise of jobs and money and education, which to Noah were meaningless, because what he says in response, he says, I don't need money where we live, and the land forms our education. And what is translated and mistranslated, of course, is not in language, but also in what is spoken, but also in their body language, and also in breaches of trust, and also the implication of the untranslatable. And the film ends in this moment where both characters kind of go to the almost both ends of the scene, and they're both silent. And Boss actually holds his mitts up to his hand because he realizes that even when he raises his voice, it doesn't mean that Noah necessarily will agree to what he's asking. And this was land that during that time was really important during the Cold War. So this is the late 1950s. And Inuit, as we know now, were being forcibly moved by the Canadian government to places like Alert and Grise Fiord to claim sovereignty over this land, and to also work at the various listening stations that were built as part of the Dew Line out of Buckminster Fuller Domes. But this land, once people had moved off of Igloolik, it meant that it was also open to different forms of resource extraction. And one of the parallel parts to this installation that was shown at the most recent Venice Biennale was an interruption. And during the opening days, there was an interruption that took place on all of the screens, and it was shown on 6 different screens, where all of the screens all of a sudden showed you or focused on the flow edge in Igloolik. And what people were talking about in Igloolik was the Mary River mine, or the Baffinland mine. And it has been built, and they're looking to expand in Kapuivik, which is Noah Piagatuk's homeland. So they said that the proposed railroad would quite literally go in front of what was Noah's doorstep. And Zach and his team in Igloolik, when they were doing this live feed, and it was the first live feed that had been done on that scale from the Arctic, from the Canadian Arctic to anywhere else in the world, what they were talking about was the mine. And I wanted to play, and it's going to be a little bit hard to hear because of the translation, but if we can all do the listening exercise together, I wanted to play a clip. And this clip is actually talking about sound. So let's listen to this clip. It'll let me. So he's speaking about the impact that the mine will have, not on our acoustic dimensions, but in fact, the impact that it will have on the animals.
But the sound disturbs the animals. And since animals can hear very clearly than humans, that we don't know this, they clearly hear the big noises that's going on, and they get scared easily. But the dust, it's fine with us. The dust will add up when the snow melts, and there would be no filters.
So he's saying something really important, and it's something that I wanted to end on. So what he's saying is that when the snow melts, there will be no filters. So if you live underwater, he's talking about the fish and whales, that as the sea ice becomes thinner and thinner, their acoustic world is going to be radically changed. We all already know that it's radically changed because of the sea noise, because of the shipping industry. But one thing that hasn't been considered yet is the fact that the snow itself and the ice itself is an acoustic filter. And whales are already deepening their songs in response to this noise. So they're changing their pitch. Their pitch is getting much lower. And they think that they're doing that in response to the noise that's happening. And so I thought that this was quite profound, that in the very first video of Live from the Flow Edge in Silikut, he's of course speaking about the acoustic dimensions of sound. So I wanted to end with that. Thank you for listening. So I don't know if we take questions. Yeah, okay. So if anyone has any questions or want a clarification on anything, happy to answer. Or if you just want to go to the reception, that's fine too. Kind of spoke during dinner. Yeah.
Candace, thank you very much for a very compelling presentation. I wonder what you anticipate. I wonder what you anticipate may be some of the sounds of the future.
Well, that's why I wanted to end with this clip, in part because I think that it's already there to a degree. I think that actually animals are anticipating this more than we are in many ways, because they've already had to change the way that they respond to the acoustic environment. So I think that one of the ways that sounds may change, or sounds of the future may change, I think is potentially finding other frequencies. I also think that because we live in such an image-saturated world, I think that that's also why there's a turn to sound at this moment. And I don't know whether that's going to change or shape anything, but I think that that's also having an impact. What's also having an impact, and this isn't an idea of the sound of the future, but it's something that I've been looking into, and that is to better understand how pre-colonial people use sound as a kind of architectural space. So one of the things that I've been really interested in is he's an amazing writer about sound, and his name is Richard Rath, and he teaches at the University of Hawaii. And he has a book called How Early America Sounded. One of the things that he writes about is the fact that places like Chichen Itza were acoustically designed. So, for example, if you clap at the base of the pyramid, it makes the chirp of the Quetzalcoatl bird. And I think actually by looking at or listening to these, I think, much more attuned ways of using sound, it will make us, I think, a much more refined understanding of the relationship between sound and ecology, for example.
Hey, Candace, can you just say, you showed this image of this amazing piece of pottery with a very graphic pattern and then some sound waves?
Yeah.
But you're talking about a musicologist at that moment, but what was that image?
That was speculative. No, there's a series of these pots, and actually Raven and I were looking at them. And the more we looked at them, the more we realized that they looked like they could sound. And all of them, that pot in particular, had various kinds of sound waves embedded within it. And one thing that I learned about those kinds of pots that I thought was pretty profound was you would think that they were actually painted in response to, I wonder if I can pull it up again, to the positive space. But actually the way that these pots are made is first by tracing all of the negative space. So already there was a kind of flip there that was taking place in early Pueblo pottery. Anyone else? That was a good question. Yeah.
Sorry. Hi, Candice.
Hi.
I have a question about the team of artists you worked with in Documenta. And I'm just thinking about how they share their stories online, so how they're collecting, I think, narratives from all Indigenous peoples from all over the world, and they're sharing stories online and seemingly not being precious about who holds the stories right now or who gets to see them. And I just thought that was really exciting in terms of art making and where in contemporary art stories are held and guarded. And just in terms of listening, I was wondering what you thought about that strategy.
Yeah, I think that's particularly true of people like Nilas. Nilas Sombi spoke actually as one of the first gestures as part of what was called the Parliament of Bodies. And what he decided to speak about, he told some of the story of the resistance to the Alta Dam, but he spoke about actually the rhythm of reindeer. And I thought that that was pretty incredible because that understanding of that rhythm is essential to his very well-being, his ability to live. And I thought that, you know, what he's been doing online is pretty generous, and also Maratana Sarah as well. And Maratana has been, you know, making this very public archive, not only of all of the hearings, but all of the artists that she's kind of gathered on the way, and they've made a new collective. And they were really interested in making all of that information as public as possible, because the way that they won their first two cases was not by using a basis in Norwegian law, but was actually making the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. First they used basic human rights law, but then United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to see to what extent that could be actionable. But I also think that, you know, one of the things that they all share is the fact that they don't confine themselves to any single media. So they kind of are always working within and between, and then there's a really high degree, I think, of community accountability in everything that they do as well. Okay. Thank you very much, Candace. Thank you.